We have with us Joe Go, who is getting his PhD with Professor Nancy Levison here in the Aeroastro department on safety. But when he's not sitting at a desk scribbling away at a PhD thesis, he's flying F-16s as lieutenant colonel in the Brazilian Air Force. So we're going to let him take it away and teach us about flight testing. And then after that's done, he and I are going to have a little discussion about what it's like to fly general aviation in Brazil. Thanks for coming.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting. I'm Diogo, and as a disclaimer, I'm not representing the Brazilian Air Force. And I came here to tell a little bit more about flight testing to you. A couple days ago, you had Lazarus, right? Laz? He was here giving a great class, the F-22 one. You might remember that, right? And he was telling already a little bit about how it is to be a test pilot in the US. And much of what he said also applies to many other countries. We also have to come from the Air Force Academy, right? We also need to be a fighter pilot. The minimum requirement to be a test pilot is 1,000 hours flying jets, flying fighter aircraft. And we do have tons of courses that we need to do. So professionally, the major difference between Laz and me is that I like Top Gun movies. That's the major difference here. So let's go with, I had the chance of, to be a test pilot, you get out of your comfort zone a little bit. You need to spend 1 year studying a lot. But you also fly 15 different aircraft in the course alone. And after that, you engage in flight testing campaigns in different aircraft for different purposes. And you're testing systems, performance, or even handling qualities of new aircraft. Sometimes it's a new aircraft, sometimes it's just a new equipment. But I'm really grateful for all the things that I did after the course. So the good campaigns, all the experiences that I had. And flying in France or flying, this was in France, in Istres. No, it's this one. Okay, this was in Istres. This is the Rafale. And this is the F-16 in Edwards Air Force Base in California. But let's go back a little bit and talk about what is flight testing, how flight testing was developed from the beginning. Does anyone here have ever seen this aircraft here? All right, which aircraft is that one? Aha. So 14 bis. What happened here is that in Paris, 1906, this Brazilian guy here, he was really good with the balloons, right? And he developed many balloons. He won lots of prizes in Europe, competitions with the balloons. And this was balloon number 14. And then he was an inventor. He decided to do something more, and he developed the heavier than the air. But no one has flown before that because no one in Europe have heard about Wright brothers in 1906. So he developed the aircraft, he built it, and he didn't know how the aircraft would react, so he attached the aircraft to the balloon 14, and that's why it's named 14 bis. And he took the aircraft for a ride, so he was already flight testing the handling qualities of the aircraft, right? Aerodynamically, 2 months before the first flight, and this is the first flight in Paris, all right? So flight testing began before the first flight, the first takeoff. He was already doing a gradual approach for what the flight would be, and he was studying in advance. So this is flight testing. But the most amazing thing about this guy is that he kept on working and inventing, and only 2 years later, he was already with aircraft such as this one, Demoiselle, and with the Demoiselle, he was able to visit his friends around Paris, right? And 110 years ago, I can't visit my friends flying. Maybe Philip can, right? But okay, let's fast forward a little bit for the Second World War. This is when most of the air forces started, right? So the US Air Force started during the war, the Brazilian one as well, because before that it was aviation in the army. And after that, they started to have a different structure. So the Brazilians, they were also flying the P-47 Thunderbolt in Italy, right? It was only Italy. And, and after this, the World War, they have this huge advance in technology, and they needed to start building huge centers to work on that technology and all the flight testing that was occurring for the aircraft that came after that. So this is a kind of weird representation of what is the south of Brazil, south and southeast, right? So the density here is much higher of any other place in Brazil. This is São Paulo here, so here we have 23 million people. This is Rio. So the place that we decided to put most of our technological enterprises is this valley here between São Paulo and Rio. So we have many of the companies and we have good universities there. Actually, they invited 2 MIT professors in the 50s, and they moved to Brazil, and they started a university called ITA. And a few years later, we have Embraer. Embraer is the third world manufacturer behind Boeing and Airbus, right? And maybe you know Embraer for the E-jets, this first one here, that you flew with like JetBlue or something like that. But actually, Embraer sold already more than 4,000 jets. And we have the regional jets, we have the business jets, right, like this one, and we have also the military ones. So this is the substitute for the Hercules, and it's brand new. So Embraer have used all of this structure that we have on that valley, all the university and the institutes as well. And one of the institutes that was developed back then in the 60s was the Flight Testing and Research Institute. Embraer needed to do flight testing, right? They couldn't be hiring test pilots and flight testing engineers from other places. So they started developing these aircraft here, some trainers, some smaller commuting aircraft. In the 60s, they started sending people to have the flight testing courses in the US, France, and UK. And in 1986, we started with our own course, recognized by the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. So I am number 91, and today we are in 120, the number of the test pilots that we have in Brazil. So the institute started with these aircraft. We had 3 of each, and today we have the new ones. We have the Super Tucanos. We have this jet here for 50, right? And this is what we use for the courses. So the aircraft that we own to help us with the course, to teach the students. But when you finish the course, you actually go to fly whatever it's needed. And it's usually like new aircraft or new equipment that you have installed, right? Not just weapons, but all kinds of equipment. And this is some of the new projects that we have today. That includes drones, and that includes like a new fighter that we are developing with the Sweden, the Gripen, and the new cargo aircraft, and so on. And to choose for this one here, we actually flew the F-18 and the Rafale as well. So it was a complete flight testing campaign in 3 different countries before deciding which one to pick. But before talking about the flight testing campaigns here, let's remember, I remember Laz was telling something about this kind of chart here, right? So this chart is the flight envelope, and we have many different kinds of flight envelopes. And depending on the aircraft, you're going to have more detailed ones or simpler. For fighter aircraft, this is very important, so we end up having many of them. And it's not just about understanding what is the limit in G's that you can pull, positive and negative, or the limits in speed. The fighter pilot who is going to a combat mission, he's actually interested in all of the edges of the flight testing envelope. So if I am taking this airplane here and I'm going to war, and I know that my enemy is applying one specific aircraft that pulls 5G at 180 knots, should I go into combat with that aircraft? 5G is 180. Should I? Anyone? 5G 180, right? This is outside of my envelope. So this guy will have a better turning radius than I have. I should not engage this guy. But maybe I have a different configuration of my aircraft that I will have a different chart.
Jogo, can you back up for a moment?
Sure.
So does that chart unavailable lift area, does that tell you at 180 knots you'll actually stall and not have enough lift before you get to 5 Gs?
Yeah, when you are in an aircraft that is not the super fancy F-22 with the thrusted vectors, right? The thrusted vectoring thrust, you will actually be exploring this curve here during your flight. So what happens is that you're pulling Gs, the maximum that you can, and the aircraft starts to have a buffet. But if you have a higher speed, you can sustain more G, but then the radius is bigger as well, so sometimes the turning rate is not good enough. But then you think about lowering your speeds to have a better resolution, right? But then you lose too much energy, and it's hard to recover without leaving the arena, right? So you're always on the buffeting and trying to keep track of your enemy, but you're feeling the buffet. You don't have anything telling you you are on the buffet, but you're feeling the shaking and the noises of the aircraft. And that's how you know how far you are on the limit of the aircraft, right? But for each configuration, you're gonna have a different envelope. And for this one here, like the Super Tucano would already have, I don't know, 30 or 40 different configurations. So an F-18, an F-16, an F-35 have much, much more. So let's talk about 2 flight testing campaigns here.
Yeah, I just had a question on the envelope. So when we were looking at the little, 172, we were looking at normal versus utility, and with utility being able to do certain maneuvers. How does that relate to the different envelope categories that you showed?
Well, I don't believe that Cessnas would have a chart like this, and the most important, you don't have anything indicating the load factor to you, right? So the most important is to understand. Sometimes for a Cessna, it's easier just to have some math in your head. So you know that for 2 Gs, it's a 60-degree bank angle turn. So every time that you have a sustained 60-degree turn, you are sustaining 2 Gs. So if you know that the limit of the aircraft is 2, you can actually do some training. Okay, this is 2. You feel actually on the pressure that you're doing in your seat, you learn, okay, this is 2G. Right?
Don't sell Cessna that short. The limit's closer to 4.
Okay, all right.
Although it's not as good as this one where
with 4 you can do a looping.
7.5.
You can do a looping and you're good. Maybe don't have the power to the top, but you can do that. So we're gonna talk now about 2 flight testing campaigns. So I was telling you flight testing, we have performance, we have handling qualities, and we have systems, right? So let's pick one first. Let's talk about performance. It's not just about developing the envelope and finding the limits. We have many other things that they have its own envelope. And one of the things that we have is crosswind. So we have limits for crosswinds, right? And how do you find the limit of the crosswind is another issue. Sometimes the limit is the highest crosswind that you have experienced during the flight testing campaign. So if the highest that you found was 15 knots, you cannot say that your aircraft is okay to take off with 20 knots. You need to put in the manual that the limit is 15. And that happens pretty often with smaller aircraft. And that's what happened with the Super Tucano. They tested in São Paulo. It's not a windy place. So the limit was 15 knots. And then they delivered the aircraft to 14 countries, right? And in one of the places that they deliver, we have this squadron here that operates in the western Brazil. So in that place, you have only one runway in the airport. You have the airport in one side of the runway, and this is the airbase, right? And this is a windy place. And sometimes when this runway was built in the 60s or 70s, they had a predominant wind, but that changes over time. So now the predominant wind is a little bit shifted. Or when the cold front is coming, they have a strong wind from another side. So in this case here, they were having like 6% of the time they were not taking off because the crosswind is higher than 15. So then they wrote a test requisition And the Flight Testing and Research Institute receives the requisition and prepares for the flight testing campaign, right? Once approved. Fun fact here, most of the other countries, as we're going to talk about Brazil, but that happens for all the other countries as well. The US is kind of unique in terms of number of runways and number of airports, right? So here, even in small places, you're going to find an airport with a huge area and 3 runways, all of them working, and perfect. But in many other places, you're going to have only 1. So fun fact, I was preparing for takeoff here once, and there was this small Seneca landing. He blew his tire, so the runway was interdicted. Oops. And then the tower told me, okay, you can take off from the taxiway. And I was in a pretty big airplane for 30 people, right? And I say, what? And he say, check the charts. Like, this is authorized to be used as a runway when we have runway interdiction, because there's no other airport in 80 miles, right? So I took off with an airplane for 30 people from the taxiway. That was really weird for me. So we took 2 Super Tucanos, and we prepare the Super Tucanos for flight testing, which means like tons of orange wires and boxes in the aircraft. Instrumentation is something crazy. Sometimes takes months to prepare an aircraft for a campaign, right? And the engineers started to prepare all the theory that would be part of like thinking on operationally how can we land and take off, all the techniques possible, all the forces, all the moments. They really wanted to understand what's going on before the first takeoff, right? So we have tons of charts, and we were already waiting, thinking about what kind of surprises we could have. So just by studying the theory that we have in flight testing, I already know here that if I have a crosswind from the right, my aircraft would tend to roll. To which side? To the left, exactly. We have at least 3 reasons to roll to the left. One of them is that my aircraft is here and it's connected to the ground, right? So if I have the wind from here, naturally the wind will be hitting above the wheels, and this will be already forcing the aircraft to roll left. But also I have a positive dihedral, which means that my right wing receives the wing with a higher alpha than the left wing. Also, the left wing is shaded by the fuselage. So we need to think about all of these small factors, the torque, and everything that could happen. And from this, we already knew that we would have more weight on the left leg, right? More weight on the left leg. But this would be dynamic. Some of these forces, they would actually change the direction as you gain speed. So how to develop like the right technique for takeoff? And we did this for landing and takeoff. And for landing, we actually haven't found so many surprises, but for takeoff was more critical. So I'm going to be talking only about takeoff today. We also need to think about all the external payload that eventually you're going to have. So if you're operating in a place that have like lots of crosswind, you don't want to have more weight on one side to be asymmetrical for takeoff, right? So we flew the 2 aircraft with the team to the extreme south of South America. So this is Argentina on the east and Chile on the west, right? So we went to this Chilean airbase. And this airbase is really important because this is the last place that you can land before going to Antarctica. And there is no fuel, no gas in Antarctica. So if you want to go there, if you're planning to go there, you need to fly to this airbase here and fill it up because you're going to be flying 3 hours to Antarctica. And you need to have the fuel to come back. And that's why most of the countries, they use Hercules and similar aircraft to operate in Antarctica. So this is what we do, and most of the other countries also do. All right. What is very important about this place, they have very strong crosswinds. So sometimes if Embraer is developing a new E-jet, they just go here to test for crosswind. But for small aircraft, usually you don't go there, only when you really need it. So we went there, and all the engineers and the technicians, they installed 3 different anemometric stations, because just before taking off, after starting up the engines, the engineer would pick which runway to take off from according on the actual wind that they have on that threshold, right? And can we play the first video? So I'm going to show 2 specific points, 2 events that they have here in this flight testing. One of them was the takeoff with 25 to 27 knots of crosswind coming from the right. So it was harder to keep the line releasing the brakes, but then the aircraft gained some speed. You can see some smoke coming out of the wheel, the tire. But then he was able to keep the line, shifted, but he kept the line. He took off, and naturally the aircraft started crabbing after takeoff, right? So this was considered okay, under the limit, right? But in flight testing, you need to go above the limit. So this is the pilot trying to take off with 31 knots of crosswind. And here is abort, abort, abort. So after less than 10 seconds, because the takeoff is like 21 seconds in this aircraft, so after less than 10 seconds, he decided, okay, I'm going to the grass if I keep on trying this, so no way. And this was considered okay. Now we know what the limit is because we went beyond, right? So the limit must be 25 knots. And they decided, okay, for the manual now, 25 knots will be the limit. And they would just tell the squadrons, you're clear to go, 25. I don't think this is so easy. Like, this is not the point. It's not just a number. You need to be making some judgment here, because it was not that easy. And that's why I ended up making a hazard analysis for my master's on this specific case. Because when you take what actually happened, we see that here this is deflection of the controls and force in the controls. So we use letters for everything. In this case, L would be roll, M would be pitch, and November would be yaw. So this is the force on the pedals, for instance. Oops. Force on the pedals, for instance. So the pilot is doing a lot of force to one side. After some time, he's reverting the force on the pedals. So it's a dynamic maneuver, right? And it's very, very critical in many ways. So we take these charts and we start thinking about other things, like which wheel has more weight, left or right? Left, right? We saw that in the theory. And is this according to the theory here? We can see these brackets here for the suspension, right? So this is more compressed. So we have more weight in this wheel here. Which tire is losing rubber here? Which one will blow first? I don't know. I don't know. This is a Super Tucano tire blown, right? We have many layers here, right? So maybe if I'm using a brand new tire, I'm just losing a couple layers, and that's okay. Maybe this would be the kind of study that I do to find a requirement, operational requirement, that to operate with crosswinds above 20 knots, I need to have new tires, or tires with less than 20 landings, something like that, right? So I need to try to answer these questions. Which tire would blow first? And I start thinking, can I try to guess when the tire will blow? Would you like to have in your cars something saying your tire will blow in 10, 9, 8? That would be awesome, right? But we don't have that even in aircraft. So we also need to think about human factors, because I blew that tire. And I couldn't know exactly when that happened. And even after that happened, I knew that I wasn't able to taxi or leave the runway, but I couldn't understand exactly which tire has blown. So it depends on each aircraft. If you have a pressurized aircraft, you don't hear anything, right? So we need to be thinking, and this is for each aircraft is going to be something different. So let's play this video here, and this is very common in the military. We have two aircraft taking off together, or with an interval of like 5 or 7 seconds, right? So the left here is the leader. On the right, we have number 2. So imagine all of you here. You are number 2, right? So number 1, release the brakes, and we have a left crosswind. And each aircraft is supposed to keep your half of the runway. Let's release the brakes. Are you ready? Like, if I'm doing the same path here, I'm going to go to the grass for sure, right? And not just that, all the gases of number 1, they are making the air turbulent for me. So we also have, like, they did something wrong here. Or like we learn, when we learn to be a fighter pilot, this is one of the first things that we learn. You need to check for crosswinds, and it's the opposite. Like, the wind must be blowing the gases of the leader to the other side, right? But I wouldn't like to be number 2 in this case. And then you start extrapolating everything that you learn for other aircraft. If you have parachutes in your landing, oh, that's pretty bad. I have used parachutes for landing in F5s and Mirage. And it's like, if you have crosswind, you need to drop your parachute in a higher speed because of that, because the aircraft start pointing to the wind when you lower the speed, and that's pretty bad. And if even the biggest aircraft have problems with crosswind, I'm worried about this guy here. And you're here to be that guy, right? Just being sure. So whenever you go for flying...
Don't scare him. Remember, Hanscom has a crosswind runway.
All right. I'm just telling, like, this is the lesson. I mean, whenever you go to fly your Ninja aircraft, right? Think about it. You have here a huge section, lateral section of the aircraft. It's not slim, right? So you will have more problems with crosswinds. So you need to do a gradual approach to the limits. All right, so this is the lesson. And this is about crosswinds. But let's talk about something different. Let's talk about systems. So this was a flight testing campaign that I was in charge of. I was flying the AMX, and we were receiving these kits here of lasing guiding bombs. So this is from Israel, the kits, and the bombs they're Brazilian dumb bombs. So you connect the smart kit to the dumb bomb, you have a smart weapon. And this laser is able to hit a target with less than 2 meters from the point that the laser is pointing, right? And we were launching this at 30,000 feet. So it works. It's amazing it works. But we had to plan and execute a flight testing campaign to be sure that it would work as promised, right? And so we went to this specific farm in the south of Brazil, that region that you saw before. But it's kind of an empty place. It's a huge farm. And we have a runway there, and we have towers. And usually when we are training for weapons, we need to have these towers to know exactly where the bombs are hitting, the rockets are hitting, right? So we sent people there, and they had to build this specific target for lasing. We have like tons of specific things that you need to take care in this case, because the target must be specific for that laser, because this laser is invisible, but it's able to burn your skin. So depending on the painting that you use in your target, the lasing will like melt the whole painting in the first pass. And reflectivity is a huge issue as well, because if it reflects the laser, then you're going to have 2 targets for the bomb. So they built the specific target for the campaign, and then we sent lots of people and drones to be sure that there was no one around, because we were launching the bombs 30 kilometers away. And you need to be sure, like, if you're launching a guided weapon, you might have surprises, and we had one. That's what I'm going to be talking to you about. So we had the drone all the time flying there with infrared sensors to be sure that we wouldn't be hitting anyone. And we have two AMACs attacking, two A1s, and a third one lasing the target, right? And the campaign was successful. We had amazing results, amazing images as well, as we're going to see. But we did have an issue here. Like one bomb fell 600 feet from the target. So we had all other bombs breaking the target in the middle. And this one bomb was 600 feet. And then we started to think about what could explain what happened, right? And we were thinking about everything, all possible things. And what happens is the mission of lighting a target was also new. So the squadron pilot, this guy here, he was also lasing a target for the first time. He was so worried about doing a good job that he was looking to the screen all the time to be sure that he would do exactly what he's supposed to do. And the bomb was already flying because it was more than 37 seconds of flight of the bomb. So the guy was lasing the target while the bomb is flying, and of course he missed the clouds. So a few clouds came because he was flying this way here, right? And he started to lase the cloud. So there was no laser for the end. So this is the kind of things that like you try to anticipate everything that could happen, but when you have human factors involved, training and many other things, you're not free of surprises. So let's play this video just to show. This is a video explaining briefly what happened in the flight testing campaign, and it then ended up being like a good video to understand all the people involved. In this campaign, we had 92 people.
Also remember that when you're going to war, make sure to tell the enemy to arrange to clear all the clouds out of the way before you bomb them.
And just send him an email. You're good. So people start like making all the instrumentation on the aircraft. You build the targets according to the specs, and you need to have many targets because you're breaking the target on almost every launch. These are the towers I told you about. We have the high-speed cameras there.
Feel better about your desk job.
Oh yeah.
Not being out of that tower.
And this is the drop test that you do just to be sure that the pylons are working properly, because you install charges, and these charges put the bomb down, and eventually you need asymmetric charges. So for one missile that we had, the charges were 75 and 25, and then we had to try 75, 50, and then that was damaging the missile, so we had to change the charges as well.
Remind me, Jogo, where was the AMX made, the airplane, and when? How old are those?
The AMX was built in the 50s, and it's half Brazilian, half Italian.
Okay.
So Embraer joined it with Air Macchi and another Italian company that I forgot about now. And they built the aircraft in the 80s and 90s. So this is the briefing, and in the briefing you have the guy that developed the bomb, someone from Israel, and we have the ones for the certification team, and you have the people preparing the bomb. In the briefing, you end up having everyone participating. And it's when you go for flying the AMX, it's usually you go to the aircraft 40 minutes before, but for these flights, you need to go earlier because you have tons of other checks to do before jumping into the aircraft. So does anyone have any questions already? I could be taking this time. So then you go for the flight. The UAV is already flying, and you have special coordination with ATC. So they clear the area for us because we're going to be like pretty high and launching this. So we need to be sure there's no GA aircraft flying in that region, right? So that's why you need to respect the restricted areas. One cool thing that you can do with the pod, the camera pod that you have, is take this kind of shots that you wouldn't be able to do in any other circumstance. Before launching the bomb, we need to be able that bomb is also safe to be carried. So before launching, you need to make a set of maneuvers that you're testing for the integrity of the pylons and the bombs. And you also have the separation issues. So why do we have two aircraft, one launching and another one as a chase? Well, that chase is also filming the aircraft for separation issues. So this was a separation in a level flight. And this is the kind of movie that you end up having from the high-speed cameras. And when you launch in a dive, you have that kind of penetration. But when you're launching like this in a level flight, so the flight of the bomb is absolutely different, and the way it hits is also different. So we had another surprise here. You see the bomb going after the hit. So the bomb actually hit before the target, and it used the target as a ramp. So the bomb was hitting at, I don't know, 600 knots, close to supersonic. So imagine where we had to go to catch that bomb. All right, I think we can go from here. It's going to be a little bit more of the same. Thank you. So the point here, that was a systems flight testing campaign, right? Just receiving a new weapon. But we're going to have, from now on, lots of other system issues. We have this huge revolution going on right now in terms of human factors. Laz was talking about helmet-mounted displays, right? And the F-35 has a kneel this, kneel that, kneel that. It's a ton of new equipment. It's a new reality for the pilot. And you have the large area display, it's touch, and you have the helmet-mounted display that you can see through the aircraft, through your legs. It projects the image below. So this is not happening only for the F-35. Actually, most of the aircraft under development right now, they are 5th generation. So this one here is another example, a different wide area display, also all touch. And this is actually for the Gripen. This is the one that we are developing with the Sweden. So it will be also a wide area display with touch. And then you need to develop all the software for that to be sure that the pilot will not have any sort of mode confusion, because you're actually in the end trying to make this sensor fusion of data from many different sources. So there is a lot of testing for that. And that's why one of those farms that we were using for weapons testing, that will become now an electronic warfare field. So it's a place that you're in the middle of the Amazon forest. The closest airport is like 70 miles. So we can install all the radar antennas that we want, and we can do all the testing that we want, right? And we're going to have to do that for the new aircraft for sure. And my final thoughts here is, like, today it's much, much easier to collect data. So we are at MIT, we have researchers all around, so we have tons of data. Everything is being registered. Even in a company like an airliner, I know about airlines that they are collecting 15 terabytes of information every week, and they just don't know what to do with that. They're just keeping the data, and sometimes when they have a problem with an engine, they would use that data to, like, look back and see if the engine was giving some sort of signs. But we can also use that data to understand a little bit more about operations, to give some hints about the culture, like landing in Hong Kong or landing in Beijing. People are starting to get too hot. People are starting to get with too much energy on that specific place. So you have a cultural aspect that would explain accidents like Asiana in San Francisco, right? So we need to learn how to use all the data that we are collecting to get the answers that we need. And this is a tough job. All right. We also have all of these new things coming. And this will be a new revolution in aviation. And flight testing will have to adapt, but everything will have to adapt. It's going to be new for everyone. And we will have lots of other safety issues as well. So we are going to be watching this happening. Boeing just announced that they made the first flight in their aircraft, but Embraer has made as well, Airbus, and so many others. So this is happening, maybe not in the speed that we wanted to, but this is happening, and we're going to be watching all the challenges that they will have. And this is going to be fun to watch. Thank you very much.
All right, folks, why don't you hold your questions about heroic. Andrew, can you kill this screen? We're going to have a panel discussion now about US versus Brazilian GA flying. And after this, I think we'll take like a short break, and you can come up and ask your questions during that break, and then we'll start up again to catch up. So, in the US, if I want to, I can have an airplane that doesn't even have a radio in it, take off from an uncontrolled airport, not tell anybody about it, and I can fly all the way to California without ever talking to air traffic control, without ever flying a flight plan, as long as I stay out of busy airspace and plan a flight that doesn't intersect with Chicago O'Hare. I can make it all the way to California, just the same way I would driving a car. Is that kind of thing possible in Brazil?
Well, in Brazil, it is possible. You can take off, but then you are an outlaw, and I'm going to intercept you.
But what do I need to do?
I did that many times because I was flying the Tucanos in the dry coast and the dry frontier. So I was flying close to Colombia, and we had lots of narco traffic coming in, and one of our missions was intercepting all of that. So one of those Embraer jets that you saw, we prepared that aircraft with tons of antennas, a radar aircraft, like our AWACS, right? And we used to make tons of operations with these aircraft. Why do we need these aircraft? Because the drug dealers, they fly super low over the trees. So a ground radar wouldn't catch it, right? So we needed to have the radar airborne. And the radar we had a controller inside that aircraft telling us how to intercept or where to go. And we were intercepting this small aircraft. It needed to be a Tucano because if I do that with an F-16, I wouldn't be able to stop at his side. So with the Tucano, it is fully maneuverable. Like I was able to intercept. We get there. We tell the controller exactly what we are seeing, which aircraft is that. We are trained to identify all the possible aircraft. And then if he tells us to interrogate, we go to the left wing, 100 meters, right? And the guy's supposed to put 1 to 1.5, and this is universal. And then you start talking to him, and you get all the information. And then the air defense, they decide if you let him go or if you tell him to land somewhere. And if he doesn't land, then you have other measures.
All right. But what if it's just a family trip? What if you were going to take, your family or your friends, from a smaller airport in, near Rio out to the countryside? What do you need to do?
Yeah,
and how is it different from
if
here?
you're just doing a local flight, you can just fill a notification 15 minutes before takeoff, and that's enough. But if you're going to another airport, you need to fill a flight plan 45 minutes before, at least 45 minutes before. Okay. So it needs to be a VFR flight plan if you're going from one airport to another.
And do you need to talk to the controllers while you're en route?
Yes, we do have visual corridors though, and it's pretty much like the visual corridors that you have here. Although I am on MIT Flying Club and we went for this fly in New York City, and I couldn't believe that I was flying in the Hudson River 1,000 feet lower than the top of the highest buildings, right? And that was amazing. I couldn't imagine that in the US you have this kind of freedom. Like we were not talking to anyone. We just took the corridor. And
So in a visual corridor in Brazil, you also don't have to talk to anybody?
no, but you need to talk to them. Okay, I'm entering the corridor, and you tell them when you leave. And you have the rules of the corridor, and that's pretty much the same.
What about fuel and FBOs? If you have a Cessna or a Piper and you need 100 low lead fuel, can you find that at any airport in Brazil pretty much?
I think so, yeah. And you should check before going. You're gonna have all the documentation. You just call the airport. The phone number is there, and they will take the call and they will tell you if they have any problems. It's good for you to check if they have the fuel, right? But for F-gas, they will have everywhere.
Yeah, that sounds better than a lot of foreign countries, just so you know. There's really no infrastructure for aviation gasoline. All you can get is jet fuel. What about flying at night? If I get a private license for flying VFR, can I fly at night?
Yes, you do. You can fly at night. The rules would be pretty much the same here. What they have that is different is, for example, the transition level here is a fixed one and it's higher. And in Brazil, for every airport that you're flying, it has a specific transition level for your altimeter. And in some airfields it's like 5,000, in others is 4,000, 6,000. So that's the major difference. The other is
What happens when you get above that transition altitude? Do you need to be on an IFR flight plan or what?
no, you don't have to.
Or just change the altimeter setting to 299 or 2?
Yeah, it's actually 1013
Okay.
in millibars, right?
Yeah.
But you can just keep on with your
The devil's
VFR.
system of units, as I think we all like to call it.
True. I don't think we are changing feet and knots in aviation ever, but some of other things like this adjustment, for instance, this will keep on being a problem. But most of the aircraft you have both in your altimeter, so this is not the problem anymore. You don't have your Jepson or anything like that anymore. But you need to know that the standard is 1013, right?
And what about how practical is it to buy a plane? You know, somebody who has a high income, like a medical doctor, can they afford in Brazil to go out and buy a small Piper, Cessna, or Cirrus?
Yeah, the prices of airplane in Brazil used to be higher, but right now we had this crisis, and people people are not flying GA that much anymore. So today it's cheaper to buy an airplane in Brazil than it is in the US. Used airplane, right? But for a new one, it would still be a little bit more expensive. The taxes would be a little bit higher. And in the past, before the 90s, Embraer was producing tons of GA airplane, and with licenses with Piper and other companies. And after the 90s, Embraer was sold, and after that, they started to build only military and jets. So all the civilian aircraft, they are jets. They are not doing, not even turboprops anymore.
What about maintenance? You know, in the U.S., you know, about at least a third of the airports will have, you know, a mechanic, somebody who can change spark plugs or do at least minor maintenance on a Cessna. Is that also common in Brazil?
Definitely not. We have much less airports. And if you go to the southeast, as I was telling you, like in the southeast and even in the south, this is going to be pretty much like here. You're going to have more airports and more qualified people. But in all the other regions, it's going to be harder for you to get a mechanic. So if you're planning to go something like the Amazon trip or something like that, Pantanal, you actually need to prepare for that.
Okay, so in the U.S., I would say, you know, in most parts of the states, every 30 nautical miles or so, there's an airport. You know, it might be more like every 20 in the densely populated areas. What would you say is a good number in Brazil for a typical distance to go from airport to airport?
Well, we have 8,000 kilometers of beaches. You can land in there if you want. No, in the southeast, you're going to find lots of airports, but in some regions, I remember, well, in the northeast, you're going to have one big airport for every half an hour of flight, and
In
two,
a Cessna, every
yeah,
half hour? Okay.
Yeah, and 2 or 3 runways in between.
Okay.
But these runways would not have support. It's just a runway, not so much support. So you end up flying from state to state, half an hour, and that works in the Northeast. But in the North, it's much more complicated because it's a sea of trees. And I remember flying once 3 hours and a half in a Tucano, and there were like no other options in between. It was just the sea of trees, and even communication in the middle. I was 1 hour and a half without talking to anyone at 8,000 feet, because that's a region that it's really complicated to have any sort of communication. There's no city. Like the next city is 500 miles from you. So
What about altitude limits over a town? If you're flying over a small town, not one of the huge cities, what's the minimum altitude that you can descend to over houses and buildings?
I think they have. I'm not sure about the limits.
Okay.
I'm really not sure.
Yeah, so here you guys will recall it's 1,000 feet above a congested area. Otherwise, 500 feet from a person or a building or a vehicle.
If it's not the same, it's pretty close.
Okay. All right, so let's take 2 questions for the crowd, and then let's take a quick coffee or bathroom break, and folks can come up and ask their questions individually. Do we have a couple questions about test piloting or Brazil? Where to go to the beach? Aziz?
Those weapons were not armed. You were just only testing the guidance systems, right?
No. When you see a weapon and it's painted in blue, at least for us, that means that is just a piece of metal. You don't have anything that's going to explode there, right? So the kit was real, and it was connected to this blue. It's a dumb bomb, but it's only iron. You don't have anything else there. But it has the same weight as the real weapon. And in the same picture, maybe you saw the missile was also blue. We were just testing for the configuration, so it was a dummy missile as well.
Good question. One more, or should we break?
A population in Brazil is flying a goal, you think, more of the Brazilian people than in the U.S.?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question anyway. So for the average person in the U.S. Versus in Brazil, if you talk to the average person, would you say in Brazil they would be more or less enthusiastic about learning to become a private pilot and doing aviation as a passion?
It's much more expensive, like the whole process. We have many Brazilians that they want to be a pilot as professionals, and sometimes they come to the US because it's cheaper. The whole package, the instruction is cheaper. We have tons of enthusiastic people about it. It's just not something easy to start with general aviation if you don't have a purpose of actually becoming a pilot. Also because we don't have this culture here of flying from airport to airport to have a $100 burger.
300 in the Cirrus.
$300 burger. So we don't have all of those airports, and sometimes you need to pay for the services in some airports. So
oh yeah, fees. Yeah, most airports in the U.S. are free.
This is the most
land and park.
amazing thing about the U.S. is landing on an airport, and there's a guy who comes to receive you, and you keep your airplane parked for half an hour or even more, and then you leave without paying anything. And I pay $46 to park my car in downtown Boston.
Yeah, so at a medium-sized city, not Rio or Sao Paulo, at a medium-sized city for their primary or maybe a secondary airport, how much would you expect to pay in fees to land and stay overnight?
I have a friend that he developed an experimental aircraft, an acrobatic one, with some other guys from the university, the same center I was telling you about. And he started flying. He was having tons of fun and posting pictures about his super cool airplane. And then he sold the aircraft. And then we're asking why. And he was saying, oh, it's $150 every time I take off. So depending on how much you want to fly and like how much you already spend in the aircraft, plus fuel, plus everything else, it end up being possible for someone who is like a pilot in the Air Force with
and
that kind of salary.
Yeah, just to give you the U.S. perspective, most airports that the answer would be free. It wouldn't cost anything. Overnight parking, could be $10 or $20 at the more popular airports. And then if you get to an insane airport like Teterboro, where you can't spit on the ramp without hitting a Gulf Stream, it's still only $55 a night to park the Cirrus. I thought that's kind of outrageous, and then I got into, I took my Uber into the Times Square Hilton, and I saw that parking a car would have been $60 a night. So it was actually cheaper to park a Cirrus at Peterborough.
And
than park
everywhere
a
you
car.
go here, you have tons of space to park your airplane, right? The aprons, they are like huge, and you will not find anything like that in other countries. You're gonna have tiny spaces, and that's why you end up paying a lot to have a small piece of asphalt for you.
All right. Well, yeah. Let's take a 5. Let's start up at 140. It's 132 now. We'll start up again, and please come up and ask your question about how to be a hero fighter pilot. So thank you.